the morning they fired me. Gerald Whitmore looked me in the eye and said I should be grateful for the years they'd given me. 29 years. That's how long I gave Whitmore Associates. Not 29 years of showing up and collecting a paycheck, 29 years of 6 a.m. mornings and missed Christmases, and staying late when everyone else had already gone home to their families. 29 years of knowing where every skeleton was buried, and I mean that more literally than you might expect. I still remember the exact moment I realized what I had in my hands. It was a Tuesday in late November. The kind of gray, biting cold that settles over Edmonton like it owns the place. The boardroom was full 47 people. Every regional manager, every department head, the company's lawyers sitting in a neat row along the far wall. Gerald's son stood at the front of the room in a suit that cost more than my first car. And when he pointed at the door and told me my services were no longer required, the room went completely silent. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already made 3 copies of everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started. I came to Whitmore Associates the same year my husband passed. Martin had been gone 11 months when I walked into that office on Jasper Avenue, still wearing the kind of exhaustion that grief puts on your face. I had a 17-year-old daughter at home, a mortgage that didn't care about my circumstances, and exactly $412 in my checking account. I wasn't looking for a career. I was looking for survival. Gerald Whitmore hired me as an administrative assistant. The salary was modest, $38,000 a year, which felt enormous to me at the time. He was 60 then. Silver-haired. The kind of man who shook hands firmly and looked you in the eye and made you feel like your work mattered. Edmonton's business community respected him. So did I. For a long time, my daughter was the reason I stayed disciplined. She was bright, the kind of bright that teachers notice, and she had already started talking about university. Dalhousie, she said. She wanted to study environmental law. I didn't fully understand what that meant. But I understood what it would cost. And I understood that I was the only one standing between her dream and reality. So I worked. I learned every system in that office. I became the person who knew where every file was, who remembered every password, who could reconstruct a contract from memory if the server went down. Over the years, I moved from administrative assistant to office manager to what Gerald eventually called his operational director. Though the title change came without much of a salary adjustment, which I noted quietly and said nothing about. I said nothing about a lot of things in those years. The first thing I really noticed, not just filed away, happened about 8 years in. I was processing quarterly reports for the Northern Alberta properties when I found a discrepancy, a small one, the kind that could easily be a rounding error or a data entry mistake. But I had been doing this long enough to know what mistakes look like. And this didn't look like a mistake. This looked intentional. I brought it to Gerald directly. He thanked me for catching it, told me it was an internal accounting issue that had already been flagged, and asked me to leave the file with him. I did. The discrepancy disappeared from the next report, and I assumed it had been corrected. It hadn't been corrected. It had been moved. I only understood that later. Much later. When the pattern had grown large enough that even someone who desperately wanted not to see it couldn't look away. The properties Whitmore and Associates managed included 4 long-term care facilities across northern Alberta. 3 of them were in smaller communities, Lac La Biche, High Prairie, Fox Creek, places where the local newspaper had 4 pages and the nearest city was 2 hours away. The 4th was here in Edmonton. Together, those facilities housed over 300 residents, elderly people. Most of them, people whose families trusted us, trusted Gerald to manage their care with integrity. What was actually happening took me years to fully piece together. The billing reports submitted to Alberta Health Services were inflated, care hours that were never provided, staffing levels that existed on paper and nowhere else. The money, and we are talking about a significant amount of money, millions over the course of a decade, was being siphoned through a numbered company that I eventually traced back to a property in Kelowna, registered under Gerald's wife's maiden name. The residents were real people. I knew some of them by name. One woman, a retired schoolteacher from Lac La Biche, had her medication review scheduled 3 times in the system and never actually conducted. I found that in the records, I found a lot of things in the records, because my job was to know where everything was. And eventually I understood that no one had ever imagined I would look too closely. I want to be honest with you about why I didn't go to the authorities immediately. I have asked myself this question many times over the years, and the answer is not flattering. But it is true. I was afraid. My daughter was in her 2nd year at Dalhousie. I was still paying her tuition, partly through a line of credit I had taken out against the house. My pension was tied to the company. I had spent 21 years building a life inside those walls. And the thought of dismantling it, the thought of what Gerald could do to me if I tried and failed, was paralyzing in a way I cannot fully describe. I told myself I needed more evidence. I told myself I needed to wait for the right moment. And then I told myself those same things again the following year. And the year after that, what I was really doing was building a file. I told myself it was preparation. Looking back, maybe it was also a way of staying close to something I couldn't yet bring myself to act on. My daughter graduated, found work with an environmental firm in Halifax, and eventually moved back to Edmonton with her partner. She married 2 years ago, a quiet ceremony at a small venue in Glenora. The kind of wedding she had always wanted. Practical and warm and full of people who genuinely loved her. I danced with her at the end of the night and thought, not for the first time, that Martin would have been so proud. By then, I had been at Whitmore Associates for 27 years. Gerald had handed day-to-day operations to his son, who had his father's confidence without any of his father's subtlety. The son, I will call him what everyone called him, which was simply the younger Mr. Prasovan. Whitmore had ideas about modernizing the company, which mostly meant replacing anyone over 50 with someone who would ask fewer questions. I watched colleagues I had worked alongside for decades walk out the door with their cardboard boxes and their severance offers and their NDAs. I knew my turn was coming. I had known it for about 18 months. So I had been preparing. The documents I had accumulated over the years were stored in 3 places: a fireproof box in my basement, an encrypted drive at my daughter's house, and a secure cloud account that auto-forwarded to an email address my daughter controlled. I had also spent 14 months corresponding carefully. Through a personal email account I accessed only from my home computer with a journalist at the Edmonton Journal. Her name was Priya, and she covered healthcare accountability. She was thorough and patient, and she understood what I was giving her and what it would take to use it. I had also contacted the Alberta Health Services Complaints Office and a senior investigator at the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. I did this quietly, over many months, providing documentation in stages so that by the time I walked out of Whitmore Associates, there were already 2 separate investigations in progress that Gerald knew nothing about. I want to be clear about something. I am not telling you this because I want to seem clever. I am telling you this because I spent years being ashamed of how long I waited. And the only thing that made the waiting bearable was making absolutely sure that when the moment came, it would count for something real. Not just a story. Not just embarrassment. Accountability. The morning they called me into the boardroom, I had already been through my desk the previous Friday. Whatever I wanted, I had taken home. What remained was entirely intentional. The younger Mr. Whitmore stood at the head of the table and explained, with the particular smoothness of someone who had rehearsed this. that the company was restructuring and my position was being eliminated. He thanked me for my service. He pushed a folder across the table, the severance offer and the NDA. He told me I had until the end of business that day to sign. I looked at the folder. I looked at him. I looked at Gerald, who was sitting in a chair near the window, not quite meeting my eyes. I said, "I won't be signing that." The younger Mr. Whitmore smiled in the way people smile when they think they already know what's coming next. He started to explain, very patiently, what would happen if I chose not to accept their offer. I opened my bag and placed a folder on the table. "Before you continue," I said, "I think you should look at what's in front of you." The room was very quiet. The younger Mr. Whitmore opened the folder. He looked at the first page. Then the second. I watched his expression change in real time. The smooth confidence draining away like water through a cracked foundation. "This is a summary," I said. "The full documentation has already been provided to an RCMP investigator, the Alberta Health Services Audit Division, and a journalist at the Edmonton Journal. The story runs Friday." Gerald stood up. I had worked with this man for 29 years, and I had never seen him look the way he looked in that moment. Not angry, frightened. The kind of frightened that comes from realizing that the ground you thought was solid has been sand the whole time. "Margaret," he said. He used my name. After 29 years, he had never once called me anything but Mrs. Kowalski. "I'd like my full pension and benefits calculated as of today," I said. "I'd also like the severance recalculated at the correct rate for my actual title and years of service, not the figure in this folder. My daughter is a lawyer. She's reviewed the Employment Standards Code, and she'll be reviewing whatever you send." I picked up my bag. I left the folder on the table. "I'll see myself out," I said. "I will tell you something about walking out of that building. I had imagined it so many times over the years, the dramatic version, the satisfying version, the version where I said exactly the right thing and everyone in the room understood the weight of it. The reality was quieter than that. I pushed through the glass door onto Jasper Avenue, and the November air hit me, sharp and clean. And I stood there for a moment on the sidewalk thinking about my husband, thinking about what he would have done in my place. And whether he would have waited as long as I did. I think he would have been afraid too. I think most people would have been. The RCMP investigation became public the following spring. The Journal story ran first, as Priya had planned, and it was thorough and careful, and it named names. Alberta Health Services launched its own formal audit. The numbered company in Kelowna was frozen pending the investigation. Gerald resigned from every board and charitable committee he sat on, which was a considerable list. His son retained a criminal defense lawyer. I am not going to tell you that justice moves quickly, because it doesn't. The legal process is slow, and it grinds people down, and it doesn't always end the way you hope. But I will tell you that the 300 residents in those 4 facilities are now under proper oversight, that the billing irregularities have been corrected, and that a woman in Lac La Biche, the retired school teacher, finally had her medication properly reviewed by someone who actually showed up. That matters to me more than almost anything else in this story. I retired properly that winter. My daughter and her partner came over for dinner the night I cleaned out my home office. And we sat at the kitchen table, and I told her the whole story, not the version I had parceled out over the years, but all of it. From the first discrepancy I noticed to the morning I laid the folder on that boardroom table. She listened without interrupting, which is not her natural inclination. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked. "I thought about that. I needed to be sure," I said, "and I needed to know I could do it on my own." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She looked like her father when she did that. The same steadiness, the same patience. "You could have told me," she said. "I would have helped. I know that now. I knew it then too, if I'm being honest. But there are things you carry alone not because you have to but because you need to know you can. Grief is like that. So is fear. And so, sometimes, is the slow, unglamorous work of doing what's right when no one is watching and the cost feels too high. I have a garden now. I have time for the friends I neglected during those years when work consumed everything. I go to my daughter's house for Sunday dinners, and I watch my son-in-law attempt my butter tart recipe with the kind of earnest incompetence that is genuinely endearing. Last month, I helped my grandson with a school project about Alberta history. And I found myself explaining, in the simplified way you explain things to a 6-year-old, why it matters to tell the truth even when it's hard. He thought about it for a moment. Then he asked if I was the good guy in the story. I told him I was trying to be, that I wasn't always sure I did it right, or fast enough, or without the wrong reasons, mixed in with the right ones, but that I tried. He seemed satisfied with that. Children often have a better sense of what's enough than the rest of us do. I don't think about Whitmore and Associates very much anymore. I think about the residents. I think about the colleagues who left before me, with their cardboard boxes and their NDAs, and I hope some of them find their way to telling their own stories someday. I think about Martin, and the fact that the mortgage is paid off, and that my daughter is doing exactly the kind of work she told me she wanted to do when she was 17 years old, and the whole thing still felt impossible. It wasn't impossible. It was just very, very slow. And it was worth it. Every single day of it.